Welcome to the 13th edition of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa at Charbagh. We are delighted to introduce session 130, Belt, Road and Beyond, presented by Aga Khan Foundation. We request you to kindly turn your phones on silent mode. And please join me in welcoming author and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington and Renmin University in Beijing, Bruno Maçães, Manoj Joshi, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, journalist and a commentator with keen interest in national security matters, Indian career diplomat Shyam Saran, who would be in conversation with Sujeev Shakya, a thought leader who traverses many worlds. Let's welcome the panel with a huge round of applause.
Good morning. It's nice. It's an honor and privilege to be moderating a panel. I'll try to be more of a glorified timekeeper and ensure that we finish on time. It's a very interesting topic we are discussing, Belt and Road. It's across 84 countries, $434 billion in brownfield projects, $188 billion in greenfield projects. And that's a lot that's happening. And we have an amazing panel. And it's interesting that, Bruno Maçães has written a book on Belt and Road, the Chinese New Order. And interestingly, all three of us have, at some point of time, reviewed the book. And so it's interesting to have this panel. And we'll begin with a round of what they feel about this whole Belt and Road initiative. And then we will have a few more rounds of discussions, and we'll open the floor at about 45 minutes mark, take a few questions, and we'll come through the closing. So, Bruno, you would like to start with, what does this Belt and Road mean to you, and how do you see it?
Well, I'll start with that note. It's quite remarkable that the Belt and Road has, in a way, started or triggered a truly global discussion. Where people from the four corners of the earth are talking about it and exchanging views on it. And I guess that has to be characterized as a part of the success of the initiative that has become a global topic of discussion. Now, in my book, I do something that I think is unusual in the discussion on the Belt and Road so far, but I think it's stood up well. Book has been published 1 or 2 years ago. And that's to talk about the Belt and Road not as a project or even an initiative. I dropped the word initiative from my book. It's a bit of a rebellious thing that I do there. But I see people in China doing it more and more. I talk about it not as a project or an initiative. I talk about it as a order, a political and economic order. So something actually of a much larger dimension. And I saw that, for example, last week traveling in Pakistan, the way CPEC, which is the Pakistan branch of the Belt and Road, has become the framework within which economic and political discussions take place in Pakistan. It's no longer the case that there is a framework given by the West or the United States, and then the CPEC is a project, a limited project taking place within that framework. No, CPEC has become the framework. When people in Pakistan talk about economic reforms, they think, well, what is better to make CPEC a success? When they talk about politics, CPEC keeps coming up. You're in a cafe or a bus or a train in Pakistan and you keep hearing the word, if you're not fluent in Urdu, the word you hear and that you understand is CPEC, CPEC, CPEC. So CPEC and Belt and Road in Pakistan have become almost the equivalent of the European Union in Central and Eastern Europe, or the equivalent of Western-led globalization in Singapore and South Korea. It's a political and economic framework. That's already the case in Pakistan. Now, what I argue in my book is that if the initiative or the framework is successful, then that will increasingly be the case worldwide or in large areas of the planet. The Belt and Road is not about an infrastructure project. Even when it was originally announced in 2013, infrastructure was presented as only one pillar of 5 pillars that the Belt and Road has. It's a political and economic order which will have an impact on global value chains of production. They will be redesigned. China will be increasingly at the center of these global value chains, and many countries will be included in Chinese value chains, and perhaps no longer as much in Western-led value chains. It will affect political relations. I think we'll talk a lot about this in this session. It will affect the system of alliances. Many countries will be pushed to pick whether they're going to be part of the Belt and Road world or part of the Western world. It will affect security questions. And I argue in the last section of my book that it will always also start to infuse world politics and world society with a different set of values, of political values. We all know what are the values promoted, sometimes announced but not really promoted by the West, and China has a different set of values that it wants to promote. So to conclude, what I argue in my book, and we'll see in the coming years whether this is too ambitious a concept or not, what I argue in my book is that when we think about the Belt and Road, perhaps the equivalent to the Belt and Road is a concept like the West. It is a plan to redesign and redefine the world order as it exists today. And I think the best indication of this, I'll conclude with that, the best indication of this is the temporal framework for the initiative. When I started to get interested in the Belt and Road 5 years ago, it was quite usual to hear that the initiative would be concluded by 2049, which was already an impressive framework for the initiative. But last year, as I lived in Beijing, I heard more and more people, officials, intellectuals, academics, talk about the initiative as a 100-year project. That means those of us who are interested in the Belt and Road will have 100 years to talk about it, and our children and our grandchildren will also be discussing the Belt and Road, and maybe my children and grandchildren will have to write books on the Belt and Road.
Thanks, Bruno. Ambassador Shyam Saran, you've written the book, how India sees this world, and so how do you see the Belt and Road?
Thank you very much, Sanjeev. So let me take off from where Bruno left off, which is I would look at the Belt and Road initiative operating at multiple levels. At one level, it is what Bruno says. It's a narrative of power. It's a narrative which tries to, in a sense, offer a very alternative vision of what the global order should be. Now, that may be the intent, that may be the 100-year project. The intent does not necessarily mean that it will translate into reality. So we should be conscious of that. But there is no doubt that the Chinese, in putting this forward, have put forward what is a narrative of power which draws its inspiration from also a certain vision of the past, which is that China was that great civilization until the Western, imperialists came and there was aggression against China, the 150 years of humiliation that China went through. But China's natural place in the world is certainly as a great civilization, and certainly as far as Asia is concerned, it has always been, except for this aberrant period, the most important country in Asia. Okay. Now, in that narrative, there is also a certain conception of the Silk Road. That is, all the ancient trade routes. The focal point of those trade routes was, in fact, China, which is not true, but that is how it is presented, because it says silk. Silk is associated with China. Therefore, the Silk Road is all about China. Okay. So what is being put forward as the new narrative, the Belt and Road narrative, then has an integral connection with the concept of the Silk Road. So that is one level at which we are operating. The second level at which it operates, which becomes a little more practical, is as a frame of, or as a means of dealing with geopolitical rivalry. So geopolitically, this is a useful concept to have. Why? Number one, because if you're looking at, for example, the Belt and Road as far as our region is concerned, the Indian Ocean, then this is the answer to what the Chinese call the Malacca dilemma, which is you have these very major trade routes, energy routes, which go through the Indian Ocean, linking up with South China Sea, and it is vulnerable. I mean, we in India ourselves say that our peninsular, character, in fact, gives us dominance over those routes. This is one way of actually overcoming that. So if you have a Chokpyu on the Myanmar coast, you have Hambantota on the Sri Lanka coast, and you have Gadar on the Pakistani coast, in a sense, what you are doing is, through those various routes which are part of CPEC and now the China-Myanmar economic corridor, you are trying to get over that Malacca dilemma. Okay. And another aspect, while there is a certain constrainment taking place in the South China Sea, in East Asia, much of Central Asia, much of Eastern Europe, actually the Chinese have very little pushback from the West. So this whole concept of a new Eurasian continent, arising. That is the second aspect. And the third aspect, which is perhaps the very frequently talked about, is that China, during the course of its very rapid development, has now created huge surplus capacity, particularly in certain infrastructure sectors. You have heard about steel and cement. This is one way, by trying to hardwire the world, this is one way of taking care of that surplus capacity, huge surplus capacity which has been created. So I think it operates at all these three levels.
No, thank you. I think it's good to just build this narrative on to see that, how do we look at it multiple levels, and maybe, Bruno, I'll come back to you on how does, from Europe you would see it. But before that, Manoj, your opening remarks and somebody watching this very closely.
Thank you, Sujeev. Back in 2016, I was asked to write this paper by FICCI. They wanted to understand what it was. And in the process of writing this paper, I myself began to understand what this Belt and Road was all about. That is pretty fresh idea from the Indian point of view. I think one of the mistakes we often make is to obsess about CPEC and think that CPEC is Belt and Road. CPEC isn't. In fact, I would argue that neither Indian Ocean nor Asia are the focus. The real focus is Europe. And why is it so? The reason is that when the Chinese economy, particularly after the 2008 economic crisis, China took a leap ahead as compared to the West. The Chinese decided that now the next stage of economic growth must focus on consumption. Consumption at home, and that they should move up the value chain. That means instead of assembling the iPhone, they should be producing the iPhone of the next generation. But iPhones are $1,000 each. So the market for that is not going to be poor Asia. The market for that is Europe. So the Chinese are targeting Europe, particularly rich Western Europe, as its principal market. And if you look at the manner in which the Belt and Road unfolded, what do you see? You see the rise of east-west railways, the railways from China, trains from China going to the capitals of Europe, Madrid, London, Duisburg in Germany, many other countries, fast trains moving. Now, many people say these trains are not economical. Chinese states give subsidy to some of them to function. But this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. The idea from the Chinese point of view is, just as the Atlantic Ocean, the trade across the Atlantic Ocean was the foundation of the prosperity of both the United States and Western Europe, likewise, they want transportation across Asia. Sea transportation, there's the Arctic route, which is yet to be to open up, the maritime route, the maritime Silk Road. They want to, basically what they're looking for is to crunch Eurasia. Crunch Eurasia, with China becoming the other important pole, West Europe and Europe becoming the other pole. And they have been extremely active. Initially, there were many missteps, so people focus on the missteps. People say Hambantota, death trap, etc., etc. But those are distractions. In 2018, Chinese investment in the Belt and Road Initiative went down. But 2019, according to a recent article in the New York Times, the Belt and Road investments went up 41%. That is despite the fact that they had a declining economy. The Chinese have again begun investing heavily. And mark you, when we say Belt and Road, this is a Chinese national project, planned by the Chinese, run by the Chinese, financed by the Chinese labor is used to execute it. And that's one of the reasons why countries like India and many other countries are a bit worried about the nature of the project. Because it is a national project. It has eventually, at the bottom of it all, there's a geopolitical goal. So there's an economic goal which I explained to you, that is China moving up, the Chinese economy becoming more and more sophisticated, producing sophisticated goods. So whatever the Belt and Road is, it is accompanied by investments that are going on in China, R&D efforts that are going on in China. The new companies, I mean, already you have for iPhones, for example, you have the Huawei smartphone, which has emerged as a rival. So the point I just want to make is that Belt and Road Initiative is about Europe and not so much about Asia, and we should not get too distracted by the Asian leg of it.
Thanks, Manoj. I'll come back to you on the specifics on, for instance, comparative on investments. But I would move with to Bruno, in terms of, as someone in Europe and, talking about Eurasia and, as also a former minister in Portugal, to really look at, what Manoj was saying, this is more of a European issue, and which you also talk about a lot in your book. So maybe you want to just talk about how does, Europe see this Belt and Road?
Yes, I completely agree with Manoj. I'm actually quite perplexed when I see titles about the Belt and Road, like China's Asian Empire or China's Asian Project or even the Asian Century, because it seems to me that Europe is critical to China's plans. And the way to think about it is we have three main poles of economic development in the world today: North America, Western Europe, and China, Japan, well, East Asia. And it's very obvious that whoever controls two of the three will be in a dominant position. So Europe appears very obviously as an indicator. Where Europe goes, the world order will go. It's no longer the case that Europe is a center of power or an actor, but it's still the chessboard where many of these things will be decided. If you look at the case of Huawei over the past year or two, it's very obvious that if China wants to build truly leading companies in the world and in a way take over the place that American companies occupy today and therefore America occupies today, it's very critical what happens in Europe. If Europe follows the United States in banning some of the major Chinese companies from its markets, if Europe follows the United States in banning Chinese companies from its supply chains, no company can make everything. So a company like Huawei, just like a company like Microsoft or Google, relies on a very extensive and complex chain of suppliers. China needs access to European technology, needs access to European markets, very affluent markets. It seems very obvious to me that Europe cannot be replaced, at least for the time being, with Southeast Asia, let alone Central Asia, let alone Africa. So the future of at least the world economic order will, in many respects, be decided in Europe. And you see that in China's decisions, very active in Europe over the past 2-3 years. Xi Jinping just announced that 2020 will be the year of Europe for Chinese foreign policy. And we have a summit coming up in Germany in May, I believe, where many of these things will be discussed. And I think we'll have a certain inkling of where Europe is going. But if you ask me what is the most fundamental question in world politics today, it's this question, is where Europe is going. There are many possibilities. I mean, there are extreme possibilities where Europe would choose China over the United States. It's not plausible. Or where Europe would completely break with China. It's not plausible. But then there's a spectrum of possibilities, and every move within that spectrum is incredibly relevant, both for America and for China.
Thanks, Bruno. I think before we move on to specific, Ambassador Saran, I would like to have a quick take, on this issue as to, as a former diplomat and watching these things closely, this whole relationship between Europe and China and Belt and Road. Your take on that?
Well, I do not disagree that Europe is certainly very much a target and a focus of the Belt and Road strategy. But I would not say that this neglects what importance Asia has for China. I think it has to be recognized that in the Chinese conception, the center is Asia. So we can't get away from that. It is possible to move towards the West because you have now achieved domination of the East. So we cannot de-link the two. That this is just a side play. This is the real play. No, both are elements of a bigger play. So I think that is the first point I would like to make. The second point is that with respect to how China is going about trying to influence the European flank, it has again, as I said, there are multiple sort of shall I say drivers at work. If you go back to Mao's China, the sense of threat from the United States in the South China Sea, and then later on the Soviet Union in the north, how did China respond to that? It started building up its western provinces. That you have to move inland, you have to move the center of gravity of Chinese economic development to the west because the east was under threat. Now, of course, Deng Xiaoping's time, it is entirely changed. The center of gravity of economic development, China moved to the coast. What we are seeing happen is that, again, since that element of threat is increasing, particularly from the US and its allies in the East, for example, the Quad that we have been talking about, or the Indo-Pacific strategy that we have been talking about, what you are again seeing is a certain move again towards the West. And no longer is it just China's western provinces, it is extending into Eurasia. So, our Pakistani friends are very fond of talking about strategic depth. So if you are looking at, from the Chinese conception, you are looking at strategic depth. Given now that China is a major power, the strategic depth not only includes Western China, but it includes, in fact, Eurasia. And that fits in very well with the larger conception that Bruno has talked about in his book, that what you are looking now at is China saying, the center of the world is once again going to be Eurasia. The maritime empires which were brought into being by the West, no longer is this going to be an era of the seas, this is going to be the era of the land. And this land is going to be dominated by China. So I think if we are looking at how do we wrap our mind around it, I think we have to look at all these different elements. Lastly, I would say that while there is this great effort and investment that Manoj talked about in terms of these railway lines and various infrastructure projects which are linking Eurasia, which are linking rather the western part of China to Europe and Eastern Europe, the fact is that it is not economic. So I look at it not so much from the point of view of this being a sort of a new economic crucible which is coming up, but as a kind of an insurance policy. That if the other traditional trade routes are going to be somehow interrupted, then we have already in place an alternative.
Okay, thanks, Ambassador Saran. I think coming closer here to India, and Manoj, when you presented this report, how did the Indian business community react to this? And because we see that politics moves in a certain way, but businesses see the opportunity, and we are seeing sort of trade and business investments between India and China at levels like never before. So how do you see this, what is happening, and what do you see this panning out going ahead?
Well, since most of our audience is Indian, I can be quite frank and say that, we too have our efforts to build communication links. We've been trying to do the Kaladan multimodal project with Myanmar. We are involved with the Chabahar project, as is well known in Iran. We have been committed to the International North-South Transportation Corridor. Actually, if you look at the international north-south transportation corridor, which basically is the idea of multimodal communication from Indian ports, Kandla, Mumbai, etc., to Bandar Abbas in Iran, then by train all the way to Europe. So this is also equally grand, meaning in the sense that in terms of conception, if the Belt and Road train lines move from China to Europe, we too have a concept of multimodal transportation moving north-south all the way up to Europe. And actually test convoys have been carried out, meaning there have been several test convoys. They are useful, you can do it. The problem is we simply cannot get our act together. We are unable to put in the kind of investments that are needed. Then of course you know that in Iran we have got entangled with American policies. We are unable to formulate, unable to cut through this American policy, this maximum pressure policy, which has disabled our Eurasian dream. Why do I say Eurasian dream? You see, if you look at the map of India, you'll see that if you go straight north, the high Himalayas block you off, meaning there's a limit to what you can do in terms of transportation. Nepal is there. It's an interesting part because one of the subsets of the north-south communication, Chinese say they will build a railway line to Kathmandu. Indians say they will build a railway line from here to Kathmandu. So we actually have a trans-Himalayan railway, but no one wants to talk about it, you see. So what I'm trying to say is that North Himalaya were blocked off. To the west, because of Pakistan, we are blocked off. So which means that perforce, in some ways, we've got to look at our oceanic identity, which is a good thing. But given the size of India, given the location of India, we cannot abandon our Eurasian dreams. And the Eurasian dreams can only come through either normalization of relationship with Pakistan or Iran. Now the problem is they're blocked off because of the United States. We've been blocked off. That INSTC actually operates through Iran, Chabahar. Now the Americans say you can go ahead with Chabahar, but the point is no Indian company wants to invest because they say if we put in money into Iran anywhere, we run afoul of US law. So at some point or the other, India has to have a larger conception of its strategy. India has to have the courage to execute a strategy which is in its national interests. Unfortunately, right now, I don't see too many signs of that.
Thank you. I think let's move the discussion to a slightly different track. There's so many things we can discuss under this, and I'm just looking at the clock, and maybe move on to the sort of whenever we talk about Belt and Road, I do see that it's just linked to investments, physical investments, how much money is being put in by China. But sitting in Nepal, we see there is a lot of these soft investments that are happening. And there is, as Bruno, you talk about, there's a new value system, a new order they are trying to build up. How does these two things go along? Maybe I'll start with Bruno and then I'll take reactions from Ambassador Saran and Manoj. Yeah.
Okay, some notes quickly, and let me start with Pakistan again because I think there will be some interest here. You're sitting in the Islamabad club talking to some people one evening, and then you suddenly realize that they are talking about establishing protocols with Tsinghua University, that they were talking about a relative that went to study in China, and then suddenly you realize that this is a different world. Because certainly 10 or 20 years ago, this would not be there. And what would be there would be American universities and American protocols. It so happens that China is moving into Pakistan in a way that it never did before, at the same time that the United States is moving away. So you see a new world of cultural connections where people are interested in learning Mandarin, where some people are worried that everyone is going to be speaking Mandarin, but certainly a different world from what it was very recently. And it's not just in Pakistan. The question is being raised a little bit everywhere. Another example, there was a scandal in Europe recently because Bosnia-Herzegovina extended a guarantee to a Chinese state-owned enterprise to build a road in Bosnia. And Bosnia is supposed to become a European Union member state sometime in the future, perhaps in the far future, but it is supposed to become a member. And we don't believe in the European Union in state guarantees for road building. So it's very obvious that Bosnia is moving in a direction where it will be aligned with Chinese economic values, with that sort of Chinese model, economic model, which in a way invalidates every plan to become a member of the European Union. The question is very relevant, and there's more awareness in Europe now that in fact there are two paths, and you can be in either one or the other. And this question then is going to be particularly critical in things like the internet regulation, data regulation, where I think what happens in India is particularly important. Question of the Belt and Road, again, is not only about infrastructure, it's about industry, it's about trade, it's about technology. In my view, the Belt and Road is essentially about technology. And so what happens in India with so-called data nationalism, with perhaps some Indian companies becoming world leaders in the internet economy, what happens with Aadhaar, all these things are very relevant for the Belt and Road, and I think it's one area where very obviously India is at the center.
Thanks. Yeah, it's very interesting because more students, like you talked about in Pakistan, and I was doing the research in my book, it was very interesting. I figured out that there are more Indian students that are going to China for higher studies and medical education than they are going to UK. You know, that's the new realities we are living with, which is very little talked about. So how do you see this emerging? Because looking at from India, and how do you see this, the cultural and the value system and the soft power moving around?
I'm often asked, that why don't we look at the Belt and Road Initiative as a huge opportunity for India? India, which requires, infrastructure, it requires capital, it even requires technology. The Chinese have a surplus of all this and they are ready to share with India. Why are you not signing on to it? Yes, sometimes the CPEC argument is used that, how can we, with CPEC going through territory which is part of India. But there is a larger question. The larger question is, as Manoj said, that this is a Chinese design project. This is not a multilateral project. It is a national project of China. There is a difference. People say, but you signed on to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. You signed on to the BRICS Development Bank. What is different here? The difference is that in the structuring of the Asia Investment Bank, India had a very critical role to play in determining its structure, what its personnel policies would be, what its lending policies would be, what would be the criteria used for giving loans. All that India had a very important role to play. Don't forget, India is the second largest shareholder. It occupies the number 2 position in the AIIB. It occupies the first position in the BRICS Development Bank. So this is a completely different animal to the BRI. BRI is not a multilateral project. So if it is a Chinese design project and the dynamics will be determined by China, being asked to sign on to it, I don't think that it's something that a country like India should accept. Having said that, even if we are not part of BRI, if there are projects where there is a certain convergence of interest, there is economic viability as we see it, and it takes into account the priority of the partner country, there is no reason why India should not be part of that. And the reference to the North-South corridor, if we are building a North-South corridor and it links up with the Eurasian corridor, so much the better. Yeah. So I'm not, I don't have a ideological viewpoint about it. But I think we have to recognize that when you drill down to the level of actually the projects that are being undertaken, the story gets a little different. In terms of what is happening with respect to the debt trap that has been talked about, how is the costing of the project being done, what kind of guarantees, sovereign guarantees are being sought from governments for projects which are being taken by, say, Chinese state-owned enterprises. There the story is very different from the very big, ambitious, larger picture that we are looking at.
Thank you. Coming to Manoj, I mean, when we are talking about the soft power, the way we are talking about in terms of how things are changing, in terms of how it's not about core investments, it's about the way business is being done is changing, because there's a new new protocols that have been developed. So how do you see, for instance, Indian companies looking at it? Because, and I want to really keep, because we do have the political viewpoint also from your, and security point, but then how do companies from the security agencies looking at this in terms of the soft power part of the Belt and Road?
I think the very obvious reference ought to be made to 5G technology, okay? Why I'll say this is, today there's a titanic battle going on between the United States and China on the issue of 5G. Now the remarkable thing is US doesn't have 5G technology. I mean, so the Europeans, Ericsson and Nokia have 5G technology, and the Chinese company Huawei. And Huawei is far advanced. And the thing about 5G is that unlike 3G, 4G, which we already have on our cell phones, 5G is going to be revolutionary. It's going to power the next industrial revolution 4.0. So now this battle that is taking place, the United States is trying desperately to block. They've been trying to get their partners, Australia, Japan, UK, Europe, they've been using all kinds of pressure. They've told Germany that if you don't ban the Chinese, we are going to stop intelligence cooperation with you. Now, why is this happening? Because Huawei has the most advanced technology, at least 2 years in advance of anything else in Europe. Huawei will set the protocols, meaning when you connect your iPhone. I'm a technological, what should I say, ignoramus here. But when you connect your iPhone to the network, local network, there are certain protocols you follow. Now those protocols will obviously be decided by the market leader, and that market leader is Chinese. Now the point is, this is just one of the things. There are other technologies which are emerging. AI, in robotics, in other areas. It's like aircraft. When you have a passenger aircraft, when Boeing or Airbus designed the passenger aircraft, there are certain test protocols. Those test protocols are often led by the United States. Everyone depends on the Federal Aviation Administration to clear those aircraft for flight, saying that, okay, these are now safe enough for flight. And by and large, DGCA and all that copy the FAA protocol. Now, because the United States was the leader in commercial aviation, therefore the United States set the protocol. Now, the thing is that that world is also changing. The Chinese are becoming leaders in certain technology, and so they will naturally set those protocols. And one other point I want to make about students, the Chinese realized something like 10 years ago that if you want to be a world power like the United States, one of the important attributes of a world power is that you have foreign students. In the sense, foreign students come to your universities, they study in your universities, and you have quality universities. So if you notice, Chinese universities have been climbing up in their rankings steadily, meaning Tsinghua University in Beijing is considered one of the finest in the world. Peking University, one of the finest in the world. Now the thing is, to attract these people, they offer generous fellowships, meaning many Indian, these people are going with fellowships. Number two, they attract teaching talent. Now, the government of India tried this back in the 70s. They said, okay, we'll get back some of our guys. But they said, you become a pool officer, your salary cannot be more than that of a university lecturer. So now if you are in Stanford University and you want to come and to join Delhi University at the salary of a pool officer, will you come? No. What the Chinese do, on the other hand, they have several schemes. One of them is what is called the 1,000 Talents Program. The 1,000 Talents Program, they have identified key technologies. They will approach you in your university, wherever you are abroad, and they'll say, what do you want? We'll give you $10 million to set up a lab. We'll give you $250,000 to buy a flat in Beijing. We will give you an annual salary of $250,000. So that guy is willing to come. But these are cutting edge people. These are people, for example, who are dealing with, right now, the Chinese focus, battery technology, electrical vehicle technology. Because the Chinese say we miss the internal combustion engine revolution. Because in our century of humiliation, these internal combustion engine cars began. But we are going to be the dominant force when the electrical vehicles and the autonomous vehicles come. And so what do you see? You see Tesla opening its first plant in China. You find European companies. And the thing with Europe is companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Porsche, their profitability depends on the Chinese market. And that is the hold that China has on Europe. The one country that understands this is the United States, and they don't know what to do. Because the United States has been spending a lot of money, so the United States still maintain a huge amount of dominance in the area of defense technology. But the United States also blew away $10 trillion in fighting useless wars in the Middle East. $10 trillion, meaning any other country would have been affected. So what should I say? This was a kind of a gift to China almost. And now you have another gift to China, but I won't speak about it.
Okay, I think I'll before we open up, maybe I just want to have a quick intervention from Bruno in terms of these new protocols, because I think working in the consulting industry and working across many countries, I do see that the biggest worry private sector folks have is that new protocols are coming up, like like 5G is coming up, and they say it's what happens in the US is 4.1G. It's nothing close to 5G, and so new protocols are coming up. And what's that? Because what we are seeing is that we are being made to be reactive, and we are never being able to be proactive, in other parts of, the neighborhood. And so how does this protocol thing is going to impact, you see?
Yes, well, there are two sides to this question of protocols or standards. First, there's a normative side, where protocols and standards designed in China become more or less universal, and we may not agree with them, but we have to live with them. They could relate, for example, to privacy. Then there's another side to the question, which perhaps is even more relevant, and that's the monetary side. When you use technology that has been turned into a universal standard that everyone has to use, for example, the USB port in a laptop. If you're manufacturing a laptop, it has to have a USB port. But part of the USB port has been copyrighted, so you have to pay royalties or licensing fees to the people who developed that technology. So far, and the Chinese complain about this constantly, these flows of royalties and licensing fees are going from China to the West, to Europe and the United States. And they amount, in many cases, to hundreds of billions or even trillions a year. Now, as we move to a different world, as Manoj was saying, where, for example, 5G technology has been copyrighted by Huawei and other Chinese companies, not only will these flows dry up, they will reverse. And Western companies, American companies will have to get used to paying royalties and licensing fees in the hundreds of billions or in the trillions to China. This is one reason that people, for example, in Germany are very worried, not to say panicking, because they can see the writing on the wall and they can see that the way the world economy is organizing is really going through a revolution. Now, let me finish by saying that I agree that I agree that this is still an open question. What I'm describing is the logic of the initiative. Now, whether it will be successful and the extent to which it will be successful is still an open question. But this, I think, is the logic. This is the purpose. This is the goal.
Thank you. I think we will open the floor for questions. And when I'm moderating, I say the ask principle. So A is always introduce yourself. S is for stick to your point, and K is keep it short. And please, let's have questions. I can show of hands. I can see one. Let me take one from here, one at the back, and one lady out there. I'll start with a bunch of three, and then we'll see. Okay, starting from there. Yeah.
Good morning. I am Colonel Rajiv Mathur. I have got a point, and it is common to all, that the Brexit is just a week ahead. The corridor or the business or whatever we were talking of the markets, once UK is out of the European Union, it will affect everything. So in this study, I am sure someone has catered for that also. Secondly, the Indian Ocean, the Humban Tota and all these things where China nowadays has got dominance will definitely affect our strategic as well as economical aspects. So
Thank you.
I hope someone can put some light on these things.
Thank you. Gentlemen at the back, can we have the mic there? I'm being a bit biased because there's a Nepal connection.
Thank you, Sujeev. Manjeev Puri, till recently India's ambassador in Nepal. Look, I have very little doubt that BRI is a Chinese project meant for global deals. And at the same time, it's no way that Asian countries, including India, can remain unaware and really not be a little wary. My question, sir, is about India. And I really want to know, why are we only looking at these options? Join BRI or don't? Why don't we look at something slightly different? And let me take you back to Russia or Europe around 200 years back and look at the Russian approach to it. You are important. You are going to be hugely important. Can you do something which is by yourself, which maintains your place there while letting the world move around in whichever way it can? A bit of ekla chalo re.
Thank you. The young lady in the...
Final year electronics student from Chandigarh. So my question is, with China promoting rising trade and increasing consumerism and trying to connect to Europe, which is a world leader in climate literacy, what are the consequences, the climate consequences to this Belt Road Initiative?
Thank you. I think maybe we'll take two more. Is that okay? There were two show of hands in the front. Let me just, yeah, the two gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Deepak. I had a question. There was this time in the history of the world where imperialism was being talked about in a big way because of the arms race, and the Britishers had developed certain arms leading to occupation of countries. Is this the new Chinese economic imperialism that is upon us?
Okay, interesting question. The gentleman out here.
Hi, my name is Rahul. I wanted to understand, and especially from Ambassador Saran, there is the economic side of it and then there's the political side of it. I think most of our conversation with China is around our worries around CPEC, because obviously it goes through POK. But the economic consequences of not joining BRI or joining, or as the ambassador said, are those only two options? I wanted to understand, are we missing out on something there by not doing that in context of our political understanding of the regional situation?
Thank you. Maybe, Manoj, you want to start? We'll take a round and then we'll come to the closing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the first question with regard to Hambantota. All I can say is that from the military point of view, Hambantota is not much of a threat. In the sense, it can be taken out fairly easily from the military point of view. Whether it develops or not, we don't know, because who is the principal market for Sri Lankan ports? It's India. I mean, 60, 70% of Indian transshipment occurs from Colombo. So we are the market. I mean, so we do have a say there. Number two, Manjeev had spoken about BRI. Well, I certainly, and here I'll defer to Mr. Saran, but I'll make out one point. The last year, the Japanese, who also are wary of the Chinese, decided to join China in 50 joint projects, 50 joint BRI projects. Now, we also, if you recollect, in the first summit we had, the Wuhan summit, we had agreed with China that we will do third country projects. We had identified third country project in Afghanistan. So the principle is there. We can do third country projects with China, but if, as he has set out, that if these can be mutually agreed on, I don't see why India should not participate in China in BRI projects, just as the Japanese are doing. The Japanese are bringing something into the whole thing. We should also bring something, maybe our executive abilities in certain areas. I'm going to skip the climate consequences business because I'm not really equipped for that. But with regard to imperialism, see, imperialism also has a kind of a theoretical thing. So I'm not going to go into that there is a, finance as the large stage of imperialism kind of thing. Whether it is new imperialism or not, one cannot say. I mean, say if you look at the Chinese themselves, they are the first people to say that, our principles are we don't interfere in the internal affairs of others, we don't do this, we don't do that. That's very well known. But we also know that the Chinese concept of interstate relations is based on an hierarchical principle. The Chinese say the big states are at the top, Small states are at the bottom. Last year, they put out their Asia-Pacific strategy document. And in that strategy document, they said, big powers should not misunderstand each other, and small powers should stay out of the way. Meaning they were quite blunt about it. They said small powers should stay out of the way, big powers should not misunderstand. And so they had been trying to woo the Americans and trying to somehow get the Americans to agree for a kind of a global condominium. You know, the famous G2 concept. And I think that is still a dream with them. The economic consequences of not joining are there. As I said, if I can get China to build me a highway from Tamil Nadu to Kolkata, now that's not, that doesn't impinge on any defense thing. They build a highway, they can't take a highway or a bridge away with them. So I definitely think that we should cherry pick Belt and Road Initiative, cherry pick it where we can, cherry pick it to our interests, push the envelope to the extent we can.
Thank you. Ambassador Saran.
Yeah, so two things. One is that I think we should not, sort of make China the tallest, giant amongst us and somehow feel completely, disempowered because of China's size and the way it is developing. It is still 15% of the global economy, and it is still controls about 15 to 16% of the global trade. So there is still a very big world out there where China's influence is not as much as we think it is, although the intent may be there. So that is the first point. Second point is that I don't think we should make the mistake of separating security from the economic imperative. These two are always entangled. If you have, for example, important economic assets outside your borders, it stands to reason that if you have the capacity, you will try and defend those assets. So I think when we try to say, oh, this is only for commercial purposes, this is only an economic initiative, I think we are making a mistake. These two things are very closely linked together. The third point I would like to make is that when it comes to looking at what India can do, don't forget that India was perhaps one of the first countries about 10 years ago to start talking about connectivity. Yeah. That connectivity is going to be a very important aspect of our own development. Now, what we have failed to do is that even within the subcontinent, we are today not as connected as we were before 1947. And that tells you something. So if you are strategizing, I think what Manjeev mentioned, the first order of business, I think, is that you walk the talk when it comes to connectivity. Then linking up with others. After all, if the Chinese are creating platforms, creating ports or creating railways, these are platforms which you can also use. Unless the Chinese, of course, insist that it should have exclusive use, which means that it would not have much economic value. But if these are platforms which are available to others, I think we should have no hesitation whatsoever in utilizing those to our advantage.
Thank you. Bruno, also you have been watching this, reading about it. Maybe you can put in some of the additional dimensions to the questions that have been asked. Yeah.
Yes, and the questions that weren't answered yet. So Brexit, well, I can tell you that Chinese strategic thinkers are not quite sure whether Brexit is a good thing for China or not. I mean, in principle, you could argue that Brexit is going to make the European Union weaker and therefore reduce the resistance to Chinese investment and Chinese presence in Europe. That European Union will never be able to be a geopolitical rival to China without the UK. On the other hand, you could say that what will happen after Brexit is that the United Kingdom will align much more closely with the United States and therefore become a difficult landscape for China. And that the European Union, free of the obstacles that the United Kingdom always created for further unification, will actually be able to move much faster towards a stronger political union. So I think it's still open how Brexit will develop, and I think this second scenario may actually be more likely. Climate change, well, depends what you think the fundamental answer to climate change is. If you think it is sort of limits on economic activity, increasing the limits on economic activity, then the Belt and Road will be a problem. But if you actually think, as I do, that the solution to climate change lies in developing new technologies and lies in a more organized development process in the developing world, then I think you have to recognize that the Belt and Road could have a positive impact. It's better to have an organized plan of development where you don't open 3 or 4 ports that are competing against each other, but you actually have a vision of where economic development is going and where technology can be accelerated in some of these countries. If you assume that countries like Pakistan and countries in Africa and South Asia and so on have to develop, then it's better that they do it quickly and in an organized way than in a haphazard way. And finally, on India, if I may add one note, I think one thing that China has done well in its conception of its development, and that I think also applies to India, is, think of the country as asymmetrical, as not necessarily homogeneous. That means China always thought of China over the past 40 years as a country where some parts of the country are still developing, but other countries are world class in the universities or in the technology sector. And the same thing applies for India. Because of the size of China and India, it's possible in India to have sectors of the economy that are directly competing with world leaders, even if other parts of Indian society and the Indian economy are still in a developing stage. The country doesn't have to move together in that sense. I suspect this may be a slightly controversial view, but it's, in my opinion, something that China did well.
Thanks. So I think I'm looking at the watch. So the final, round because when we are looking at Belt and Road, people are talking about 2049. It's a 100-year, sort of a project. If you look at 2030, 2035, 2040, how do you see this, sort of going forward? Do you see this succeeding? There are going to be impediments? A quick 1-minute answer from each of the panelists. Maybe I'll start from Manoj.
Yeah. Last year, I was at the second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. And the overwhelming impression I got was that the Chinese are cleaning up their act on BRI. They are really learning lessons. They are implementing new protocols for giving out loans. They are taking criticism on board. So I think, given that kind of a trend, the Chinese will succeed.
Thank you. Ambassador Saran?
Well, unless it becomes a universal kind of a narrative, like what Bruno mentioned as the concept of the West, it cannot succeed. So it has to have that universalist kind of narrative. And I think as far as that is concerned, we are still in very, very early stages. Secondly, I think it is not looking at the world which is now coming into being is a world which is going to be extremely globalized, and in dealing with issues like climate change. And today, look at what's happening with this coronavirus. You may have a public health challenge which may arise in some remote corner of the world and then spread across the world like wildfire. And the only way that you can deal with these challenges is by having global collaborative responses. We are still living in a competitive frame as far as geopolitics is concerned. That kind of geopolitics, I'm afraid, is going to become increasingly relevant.
Thank you. Bruno, your final words?
I think the main question is whether China and the West will decouple, whether they will, in fact, develop as two separate spheres, a little bit similar to the Cold War, or whether they will remain integrated. I personally think it's more likely that they will remain integrated, but they will be highly competitive. I think we'll have a world where these blocks are integrated, but they will be competing against each other in a rather ferocious way. I think we've seen that already in the past year or two.
Thank you. So a round of applause for great panelists, and it was very interesting. Thank you, audience, and this has been a great discussion. Thank you all.
We wish to thank Bruno Maçães, Manoj Joshi, Shyam Saran and Sujeev Shakya, along with Aga Khan Foundation for this very enriching and gripping session. Do note that the authors will be signing their books at the book signing desk located right at the entrance of Charbagh. The next session at Charbagh is session 136, Bolna Hi Hai, What Must Be Said. I understand that we're all very excited about the session, but I request you to kindly keep the aisles clear. It's for your own safety and security. So we've got a center aisle that we need to be clear at all times, along with the side aisles. We can, however, Sit, yes, we can all sit under the stage. This is perfectly fine. Thank you so much. Also, if I could request the younger people to give up their seats for the seniors over here. There are some people who've had, knee surgeries and they need to be sitting on chairs. So if you could just be kind enough to give up your seat for an older person, it would be really nice. Thank you so much. Please help us keep the aisles clean. Anushil, can we make sure that the center aisle is clean and clear? Sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, this is for your own security. I request you to kindly keep the center aisle clear. Our volunteers are here for your assistance. Also, we request you to kindly give up your seats. The younger people, children, could maybe give up their seats for the slightly senior audience.